Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Network Voices Conversations interview series. In this series, members of the Marathon of Hope Cancer Centers Network's Patient Working Group chat with network researchers and clinicians about topics that matter to us. Before we meet today's guest, we'd like to introduce ourselves. I'm James Pereira. I live in Toronto. I was born in Bombay, India, and migrated to Canada in 1995. I have an undergraduate degree in zoology and biochemistry and a graduate degree in biochemistry and molecular biology. I previously worked in toxicology research and taught undergrad. I'm also a volunteer driver with the Canadian Cancer Society's Wheels of Hope program since January 2018, and I've been a patient survivor caregiver, PSC proposal reviewer for CCS funding grants since September 2021. I've also been a member of the Patient Working Group at MOHCCN since its start. I work in the arts industry providing subscription sales and fundraising services to arts organizations. Even though I was away from the scientific field for several years, I'm grateful my life has found its way here. I've had several people close to me in my life who've had cancer, and it's an honor to be working alongside my friends in the Patient Working Group who lift me up every day to carry on Terry's dream and mission of cancer research advocacy. I'd like to turn it over to Sheilah to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Sheilah. I live in the town of St. Lambert or St. Lambert, just south of Montreal. I'm self-employed and I work in the email security threat intelligence sector. And on the side, I work as a vocalist and do some voiceover work. I'm a huge fan of Pilates and running, although running is on hold right now. And I've been participating very joyfully in the Terry Fox runs for more than 20 years. I am a huge animal lover and I advocate by volunteering and fundraising. And I currently live with my husband and our rescue dog, Charlie. I was diagnosed with stage 3 colorectal cancer in May 2022. I was fortunate enough to have genetic testing, and that genetic testing resulted in a diagnosis of Lynch syndrome. So I'm currently considered a high-risk patient and in an observation stage. I like to tell people that while this diagnosis doesn't define me, it has really changed me in many ways, in big ways and in small ways. Becoming a member of the MOHCCN Patient Working Group has really allowed me to share my experience, and I'm hoping that it helps other cancer patients and survivors. And ultimately, it's helped me in untold ways.
Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest, Dr. Samantha Pollard. Dr. Pollard is an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University and a co-investigator in the Canadian Network for Learning Healthcare Systems and Cost-Effective Omics Innovation, CLEO. She is also a member of the Marathon of Hope Cancer Centers Network's Health Technology Assessment Working Group and the lead researcher on a project funded through the network's Patient Voices in Research initiative. Welcome, Dr. Pollard.
Thank you very much for having me.
Normally, so my first question to you is, normally when we think of cancer researchers, we think of clinical research. But your research focuses on health systems and patient engagement. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your field of study and what got you interested in it?
Thanks very much. Sure, of course. So my interest in health research really began kind of in my undergrad. I was working in bioethics, and I really started to be interested in kind of how patients and community members, how we make decisions around healthcare and kind of the role of patients and community members in informing policies, informing policy change, and also the role that patients play in making decisions around their own care. I did my master's degree at McMaster University, and again, I was working in an area called shared decision making, which is this this idea that we can bring patients into this decision, because integrating values and preferences is really what forms appropriate decision making. So what might be a good decision for one patient could be very, very different from another patient based on their own values, what's important to them, their own personal circumstances. And then I did my PhD work at UBC, and my postdoc was conducted at BC Cancer. And at BC Cancer, I was a part of the cancer control research program there, and I really became interested in how we can use patient values and preferences not only as a standalone research outcome, but how this information can be used to inform access decisions, how we can use patient preference information also to inform what gets publicly funded. So we live in publicly funded healthcare systems. There's a lot of competing technologies and health services, and all of this costs money. And so I think that to be able to make sustainable decisions, and decisions that really reflect the values of patients and future patients, we really need to have this information be a part of that evidence base. So that's really what got me here, and started to really think through these questions specifically within the cancer space and rare diseases, pediatric rare diseases as well. So I'm very much a health services researcher and a mixed methods researcher as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Samantha. That's great. Sorry, James, interrupting you. I have a question for you. For anyone that's hearing this for the first time, can you explain what is precision oncology and what makes it different from the standard of care in Canada?
Sure, of course. So actually, your introduction did a really nice job of explaining precision oncology. I think it's the use of genetic and genomic technologies like multi-gene panels or whole genome sequencing to generate information that can help patients as well as their healthcare providers and their families make decisions that is tailored to that individual. So decisions about prevention strategies, decisions about treatment strategies. And this doesn't necessarily always mean aligning patients to the newest, most exciting treatment. It can also mean identifying information that suggests that perhaps a patient might not respond to an existing standard care treatment. So it's about information, and it's about how we can use that information. But that said, precision oncology information, genetic testing results are complicated. There's a lot of uncertainty around, what's going to be generated through that test and whether that information can be linked to a new treatment or a decision. So there's a lot of uncertainty within precision oncology as well, which patients and their healthcare providers and their families have to navigate. And so the second question you asked was, how does this different from standard care? And I think the way that I think of it is, up until relatively recently, cancer was often characterized and treated based on the cancer type. So is it breast cancer? Is it colorectal cancer? Is it pancreatic cancer? But now with these new technologies, we can actually kind of characterize cancer on a more molecular level and say, one person's breast cancer actually looks a lot different than another person's breast cancer. And so using that information to again make decisions not only based on the cancer type, the tumor type, but also what's the unique biology of that cancer. And so, as I said before, what makes it different from standard care? There's a lot more information. That information is complex. And also, there's often a lot of uncertainty in terms of what we can actually do with that information. So I think that, with the introduction of precision oncology and genetic information, I think it presents a huge opportunity to use this information in ways that reflect what patients want. But also, there's a real challenge in presenting the information in a way that patients can actually use it. So as I said, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of the likelihood that perhaps you're going to develop a particular cancer if you have, for example, a hereditary cancer syndrome. And what are the strategies that might help you prevent the onset of disease, diagnose it earlier, and better treat it?
Thanks. I actually have a follow-up question, if that's okay, on this same topic. Obviously, as a cancer patient, I spend a lot of time in waiting rooms and have the opportunity to speak with other patients. And I'm often really surprised by how many of the patients I speak to have never even heard of precision oncology or what it could do for their treatment. What do you see as the main challenges keeping precision oncology from benefiting more people, more patients? And how much of that do you think comes down to an awareness?
That's a really good question. And I think awareness is part of the issue. But there's other parts of the issue that I think are equally important. And these are kind of the questions that I face day to day in my research. And I think the first is, when I mentioned uncertainty before, a huge part of resolving uncertainty is having data, having good data, not only from Vancouver or BC or Ontario, but being able to acquire that data in a rapid way, comprehensively, so that we can generate better estimates, so that we can identify, yes, this particular genomic aberration is pathogenic or is cancer causing, and this is what we can do about it. These are the treatments that might be available to target that particular aberration. So I think part of the issue with kind of increasing or moving precision oncology from research into clinic is certainly doing a better job at generating evidence, generating data, and linking that data so that researchers can conduct evaluations and be able to resolve uncertainty and be able to provide more certain evidence to patients and their families when making decisions. Something that you had mentioned in your question, broadening access to precision oncology. I think that equity is a real barrier. So being able to reach patients in rural and remote communities, ensuring that we're not just reaching patients of a certain demographic or within certain, large city centers that are close to treatment facilities and testing facility. So I think that access is uneven, and that's something that I'm really interested in kind of developing strategies to broaden access, to bring precision oncology, to bring testing and bringing research to not only more Canadians, but a more representative group of Canadians. So I think that's a real challenge. And then, of course, and this kind of links back, I think, to this issue of, data and evidence. When we develop or let's say somebody undergoes a genetic test and they say, okay, well, there's a treatment that's available for your particular genomic aberration, but it's not publicly reimbursed, or it's very, very expensive. So testing and treatment is very, very costly. And so it's not available to everyone all the time. Sometimes those treatments don't even exist. Sometimes we can say, okay, it looks like you've got this aberration, but we can suggest what this may mean for your quality of life or your prognosis, but there's no targeted treatment available. So again, there's that lack of being able to match patients with treatments. Is it available? Is it accessible? And then, of course, other barriers that I've talked about, like what is the cost of the technology and or the treatment, and are there clinical trials available as well? So I certainly do think that awareness is an issue, but I think there's a lot that we need to do to bring precision oncology, as I said, kind of shifting it from research into clinical settings. And I think from my perspective, that's around what data do we need to collect? How do we link it across Canada, which is a real challenge? How do we link it quickly so that we can generate evidence that is going to inform decisions, today or tomorrow, not 10 years from now?
Thanks so much.
Staying on the patient perspective, when conducting their research, clinicians and researchers will look for results that are clinically meaningful. But your work focuses on what patients themselves view as valuable. How do you define patient values, and how is your research helping to identify what those are? As well, what are some considerations that are important to patients, but that tend to be overlooked?
Thank you. And I think that's a really wonderful question. And I define value very broadly. To me, value is what matters most to patients. And that can be what matters most when they're reading a consent form. What is the information that they need to see in a digestible way that's going to help them make a decision about undergoing a genetic test, attempting a new treatment, or enrolling in a trial. And so, as I said, it's broadly defined, but it's not only what are their preferences, but what is the rationale that underlies their preferences. And so I'm really, really fortunate in my work, certainly through the work that was funded through the Patient Voices in Research Initiative. And part of what we did in this project, we really started with sitting down with patients and caregivers and saying, what information do you need? What's going to help you make this decision? And people had a lot of really great feedback for us, but often we found that it wasn't necessarily about estimating the length of life, the added anticipated increase in life on a particular treatment or enrolling in a trial. What we found was that patients really were interested in, what is my life going to look like if I initiate this trial or start this treatment? Am I going to be able to throw a ball around with my kids? Am I going to be able to enjoy a beer having a barbecue? It's those types of things that we found. And so it's really what matters most to people. And that's the information that we, as researchers who are developing consent forms or having clinical discussions with patients about a treatment or a trial, I think that's what's really important. And so some of the methods that my team uses, we use, patient engagement. So again, with the Patient Voices in Research project, we were incredibly fortunate because we actually got to just sit down with the patient working group before we had been pen to paper, before we had written out any research questions. We had discussions about, what we want to do is make trials more accessible. We want people to want to enroll in trials. We want the experience of being in a clinical trial, a precision oncology trial, to be manageable. We want data collected that patients want collected. And so we conducted interviews and focus groups, but even those questions that we asked were informed by those early discussions that we had with the working group. So interviews, focus groups, surveys as well. So those are kind of sit within the research setting, but I think also in the clinical setting, when we talk about shifting precision oncology from research into clinical settings, I think asking patients how they're doing on treatments, quality of life surveys, routine quality of life surveys, when you ask the question, you mentioned that we're often interested in these clinical endpoints, which of course are really, really important. Are patients responding? Is the size of their tumor changing? Is there an increased survival? But also, how are patients feeling on these treatments? Are they able to do what they want to be doing? What's valuable to them? So we call those patient-reported outcomes. And so I think those are really important to be collecting as well. And I think critically, in terms of what I do and the team, the incredible team of people that I work with, we can also use this information not as something that sits beside a summary of the clinical evidence, but it's incorporated as part of the evidence package. So we can use patient quality of life information to inform whether a treatment is cost effective, if we should be reimbursing it, and for whom. And so that information is really, really critical, and it should not be an option to collect it. It's really a part of that evidence base that I think is incredibly important. And so, just being a little bit more specific, you'd ask what are some of the what's some of the information that gets lost or not collected. So I'm thinking about, when we think about participating in a trial, there's additional visits to a hospital. There's additional data collection. Maybe there's additional blood tests. There's driving. There's parking costs. If you have children, you might have to get childcare or bring in somebody, a family member or a loved one, to help support that. There's those hidden or indirect costs associated with, again, if you don't live in a major city center, you might have to take a flight, you might have to stay in a hotel. All of these things that are life disruptions, I think are really critical to what we've heard is that they're really critical to patients' willingness and ability to engage with precision oncology. So I think it's really important to capture those. I think the other thing which we heard through this project was, the emotional burden of going through cancer treatment, of deciding on whether to enroll in a trial, what that trial is going to look like for the patient, for their family. All of these things are not necessarily linked to the clinical, does it work on a molecular level, but what is the patient experience, and are patients going to be able to engage with these technologies?
Excellent. Thank you.
Kind of continuing on this theme, again, I find that patients are often eager to share more about our experiences, but there are still so many questions and concerns and impacts on our lives that we're never asked about when we're participating in research or undergoing treatment. How can those patient values be turned into data that can meaningfully influence research and treatment decisions rather than just being sort of an afterthought?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and it's something that we grapple with a lot. I think the first thing is to get patients being part of research, to invite them to be a part of research teams. So not providing a report at the end of the study and saying, do you agree with this? But having them help co-design those research questions. And when I say co-design, I mean being a part, sitting at the table with the scientific research team. What are the questions? What are the methods that we should use when we're putting information in front of patients who are enrolling in a research project? What should that information look like? How should it be phrased? What is the information that we cannot leave out? Also, what data should be collected throughout the research project? Or let's say we're designing a clinical trial. What information is critical? What do patients want to see at the end of the day? What do they want to make sure that we've reported on? So I think that's really, really important. Something else that I also mentioned earlier is these patient-reported outcomes. So what information do we need to be collecting from patients, not only when they start a treatment or they enroll in a trial, but throughout that entire care trajectory? How is the treatment or how is the experience of participating in research affecting their life? Patients we make trade-offs all the time. And so to engage with to initiate a new treatment where there's uncertainty around whether that's going to work, whether that's going to benefit you in terms of quality and length of life, that's going to be weighed against other things that patients could be doing with their lives. And so I think that's really critical. And then I think also, as I mentioned before, when we conduct evaluations as researchers, as a health economist, it's really critical for me to have quality of life data from patients, from their caregivers, and also having an idea of what those hidden or indirect costs are. What are the other aspects of burden that bears on patient and families' experiences throughout the research or the treatment trajectory. And we can use that information and, as I said, actually build it into that evidence base. So to your point, Sheilah, it's not reported at the very end in a single paragraph saying, oh, and we also found that patients experience adverse events, but actually being able to incorporate it into an evaluation as part of the evidence. And I think another part of that, which is something that we're also really, really interested in, is not only talking to patients and family members, but also talking to people who are involved in health technology assessment, who actually make these decisions, and saying, what information do you need from patients to be able to make a decision? Because after all, as I said earlier, when decision makers make a decision about a new treatment or a new genetic test or a new service, it's always in comparison to something else that maybe currently exists or something else that's coming up the pipeline, because resources are finite. So talking to decision makers also about what information they need and how we can generate patient preference information and family preference information that can be meaningfully built into that evidence base, I think is really, really important.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And that leads me to a final overarching question. I often ask researchers to describe their dream outcome for their research. What would cancer care look like in your ideal world? When you think about the impact you hope your research will have, what do you imagine the future looking like for patients if the data you're collecting is really put to use?
That's a big question. So I think, I'll touch on a few of my, hopes and dreams. I think for starters, I would like for informed consent procedures and those discussions that patients have with their physicians, with their study teams, and go back and talk to their families about. My hope is that we can get to a point where that information that's provided to patients and families is presented in a way that's digestible to them. So a 30-page consent form does not always mean that people are retaining that information, or that it includes information that they want or that they need to be able to make a decision. So I think that if we can ensure that we know what information that patients and families want in order to make a decision, that's certainly a starting point that I hope that I have. From the perspective of precision oncology, my hope is that we continue to get to a point where not only are patients aligned better to treatments that are more likely to generate outcomes that are important to them, including quality of life, length of life, but also that patients are not initiating treatments that are unlikely to benefit them. I spend so much time sitting down with patients and families talking about what it's like to go through cancer treatment. And it's challenging and it's costly and there's anxiety and emotional burden. So if we can get to a place where if a patient is unlikely to benefit, using this information generated through these tests to de-escalate their treatment, I think is really, really critical as well. It's not always about the newest, most exciting, shiny treatment, but sometimes it's about really focusing on that quality of life and reducing harm that we're doing to patients and their families through treatment. So I think that's really important. My hope is that we can improve the shared decision-making aspect of treatment decision-making, so that patients are, and I think that, what I've heard is that, patients often do feel a sense of vulnerability when they're talking to their care teams or their study teams. And so really recognizing the importance of integrating patient values into those decisions is really important. And then I think one thing that, I'm working on as well with my team is really thinking through equity. So broadening access to precision oncology. And, when I talked about things like in consent forms and consent procedures, making sure that we're including equity issues in there. We're including the right people to be involved in consent procedures. We are able to answer questions that are unique or specific to people's cultural backgrounds, religious backgrounds. We're reducing language barriers. All of these strategies to bring in not only more people into trials and experiencing precision oncology, but really getting that equity issue, I think, is really, really critically important. The project that I'm working on right now with the Patient Voices in Research initiative is really focused on kind of providing better access to precision oncology clinical trials across Canada. And we've been, again, so fortunate to be able to sit down with people who've been really transparent with us about, I need people of my cultural background for me to be able to ask questions to, language issues. I want to bring in family members to be a part of that conversation. Even just consent procedures. They shouldn't be a one-off, read through this form and then, sign your consent, but enabling patients to go and talk to their community members, talk to their families, and have that be more of an iterative process, I think, is really important too. And it's kind of a first step to addressing those equity issues that we see so much in oncology in general, but certainly precision oncology as well. So I would like to see it reaching a broader spectrum of our population.
Thanks so much, Samantha. This seems like a really good place to wrap up our conversation today. Again, we thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to chat with us, and also for your really, really important insights into precision oncology in Canada today. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was lovely to talk to you.
Thank you.